Our next speaker will be Shobhit Mehta. Shobhit is a security and compliance lead at Ginger, an on-demand mental health company here in San Francisco. Today we're going to be talking about achieving high trust on a budget. Take it away.
Thank you, JJ. Hey everyone, thank you for coming and thanks to the organizers for having me. My name is Shobhit and today I'm going to speak about achieving high trust on a budget. Over the last 2 years, I've been working extensively on the high trust project for Ginger, now HITRUST Health. And in those 2 years, I have had the opportunity to work with a number of different companies and ask about their best practices. My goal today is to distill all the learnings and experiences that I had over the last 2 years and distill those in 10 bullet points for your high trust journey. About me, I am currently the Security and Compliance Manager at HITRUST Health, former Ginger. I held GRC roles at PayPal, Fidelity Investments, Deutsche Bank, Credit Suisse, and HSBC. I did my master's in Information Assurance and Cybersecurity from Northeastern Boston, and I'm highly interested in healthcare compliance, privacy, running, and writing. So if you have similar interests as mine, please reach out after the talk, and we can have a very good conversation regarding that. And these slides will be available after the talk, so you don't need to take any pictures unless you really feel the need to do so. So what are the goals for today? What are we going to speak about in the next 40 to 45 minutes? So my goal is to give you some guidance on how to prepare for high trust assessment on a budget and in a timely manner. I have seen companies spending more than $300,000 and still manage to fail the certifications. And we at Ginger and many other companies have achieved similar in less than $100,000, and we were able to pass the certification. So my goal is to give you some guidance on how to reduce your budget, what are the open source tools that you can use to keep your budget within $100,000. And when I say in a timely manner, it's within a year or 11 months like we did at Ginger. The other goal that I have for the talk today is to give you some guidance on initiating successful organization-wide security programs and cross-functional projects between technical compliance teams. From my experience of working with the different teams, there is always this dichotomy between the engineering teams and the compliance teams, and they don't speak the same language. So my goal today is to give you some guidance and bullets which will help you speak the same language and be on the same page for your high trust assessment. And lastly, I would like to give you some guidance on tools that we used at Ginger, at HITRUST Health, that will help you alleviate some of the budget pain that you will face in your high trust journey. With those goals, a couple of assumptions as well. Now, I'm assuming that you have some familiarity with high trust, but don't know where to start. And what I mean by that is, you know how to do the scoping, you know how to reach out to the external assessor, you already finalized an external assessor, but you don't know where to start to keep the budget down and start the process of high trust. The other assumption that I have is you have limited resource in terms of operational cost and time. And like I mentioned earlier as well, one of the goals of today's talk is to keep the budget within $100,000 and the runtime to be less than a year. Which brings to my third assumption that you have at least a year between now and your high trust external audit. If you don't have an year between now and your external high trust audit, which is going to be with your external assessor, it's going to be hard to replicate all the learnings from these slides. If you have a few quarters between now and your high trust assessment, you may leverage some of the learnings from this, but the ideal scenario would be you are planning your high trust external validated assessment sometime this year in 2023. And lastly, Ginger, HITRUST Health, we are always a SaaS first company, and all the learnings that we had were on the same lines. So I'm hoping that you also had a similar learnings or you have a similar infrastructure where your infrastructure is heavily relied on SaaS. We at Ginger, HITRUST Health, almost never go for on-prem services. We look for services which are SaaS-based and they can do all the security stuff for us and we can do the due diligence. Now, why high trust? Why not speak about SOC 2 or why not speak about ISO 27001 which are in this similar space? And when we were deliberating which assessment we should be doing, we came up with these three pillars for high trust that I think are extremely important to learn and understand. In high trust, what you can do is you can have multiple authoritative sources. So for example, if you are a healthcare company like us, you can have HIPAA in your scope. If you are a company based in California, you can have CCP in your scope. If you are based in the UK as well, or you need to comply with GDPR, you can have GDPR in your scope. And similarly, if you have a PCI or if you're a payment processor, you can have PCI in your scope. So rather than having all these different certifications that I have seen many companies do, what one HITRUST certification, and when you'll be doing your scoping, you can have all of these in your regulatory factors. And what HITRUST does, it does all the hard work for you and gives you the list of controls that you need to comply with all these different authoritative sources. The second reason that we chose HITRUST and not ISO or SOC 2 is it goes beyond the CI triad. From my fair share of experience, that it's very catered towards the security, logical HR controls, and it doesn't necessarily speak about the privacy, about the regulations, about the compliance in different industries. So for example, unless and until you are going for SOC 2 plus HIPAA, there is no way you need to have, you can get certified for HIPAA as well. If and you want to comply with privacy standards as well, then you have to go for ISO 27017, which is a different standard altogether. So this was the second reason we chose HITRUST and not the other standards that are in the industry. And last but not the least is scope is paramount in HITRUST. I have seen some companies who just don't feel the need to have the critical systems in scope. And when you speak, so you can say this is outside of our SOA, or we are not storing any confidential information there, and you'll be all good. You don't need to worry about having those critical systems in scope. But in HITRUST, the first thing that you will do with your external assessor is to finalize the scope. If your external assessor is good, they are going to ask you a bunch of questions. They are going to have held workshops with you. They are going to ask you how many transactions are you processing? What are the number of interfaces that you have? How many systems do you have in scope? Where are you storing confidential information? Do you have any offices in the other regions where we want to get compliance with? And all of these adds up to the cost and number of controls in your HITRUST assessment. So this is extremely important to discuss with your external assessor that what's the exact scope of your HITRUST. A bit about Ginger's HITRUST journey. So I joined Ginger in January of 2020, and I took a couple of months to understand the systems and the processes and policies that we had. And then from May to April, we did our gap assessment. We took that quarter to perform the gap assessment at Ginger, and then from May to August, we did the gap remediation, which is equally important piece of HITRUST. In September to December of 2020, we did the audit interviews. We asked our external assessor to come and speak to our different teams. We submitted all the evidences, and in February of 2021, we were able to receive our final validated certification from HITRUST. And a bit about HITRUST metrics as well. So like I mentioned earlier, HITRUST is extremely prescriptive, and it requires a lot of evidences. So when we submitted our HITRUST assessment and we did this analysis, we realized that we submitted more than 1,200 pieces of evidences to HITRUST. We created, modified, reviewed more than 400 pages of policies and procedures that in turn led to 42 different policies, procedures, and documentation for our entire company. And lastly, talk about Zoom fatigue. We held 186 meetings between internal and external stakeholders. 142 of those meetings were with internal stakeholders, and when I say internal stakeholders, those are the teams in engineering, sales, legal, compliance, privacy, and 42 were with external stakeholders. So just like you have internal stakeholders, you will have to reach out to AWS, who is your IS provider or something similar. You will have to have meetings with your external assessor who will be doing the audits. You will need to have some meetings with the HITRUST themselves to get the subscription and make sure that you are having the right subscription and number of users for your MySSF portal, and so on and so forth. So we held 186 meetings at the peak of Zoom fatigue. A few more metrics. So when we started this journey of HITRUST, we were at 180, 89, 190 people across Ginger Headspace Health. across Ginger, not HITRUST Health. And 33 of those team members actively participated in certification in some way or the other. So effectively, 1/6 of the entire company was participating in HITRUST in some way or the other. We implemented 7 tools to fill the gaps that we realized in our implementation domain. And then we started 10 security projects for our HITRUST assessment. Okay, enough of the backstory. Before jumping into the talk, just wanted to give you this breakdown of processes, tools, and documentation. So the next 10 points, I tried to break those between processes, tools, and documentation so that you can delegate accordingly who are responsible for these pieces. If somebody is responsible for processes, you can reach out to them, and so on and so forth. So the first bullet that I learned from my conversations and my experiences is you need to perform the gap assessment and remediation yourself. When you outsource the gap assessment and remediation, you are not only outsourcing this piece of the audit, you're also outsourcing the relationships you're going to build with different teams when you will do this exercise with them. You're also going to outsource learning all the processes and the tools that they have implemented in their systems. And last but not the least, you're going to pay a lot of money to your external assessors. The gap assessment, ideally what the companies do or the external assessor do, they charge you by the number of main days, which is equivalent to the number of controls that you will have in your scope. And if you have a large scope like we had, it's going to charge upwards of $50,000 or $60,000 for the gap assessment and remediation itself. So this is my first idea to get the budget within $100,000 and keep it timely. And how to do that? So you can leverage MyCSF for doing your gap assessment and remediation yourself. So if you have a subscription of MyCSF, what you can do is once you have the scoping done, you can download all the controls from MyCSF. And you can have those controls in the Google Sheet or something similar. And what you can do is you can plan your gap assessment and remediation accordingly. Once you do that, you can have the Google Sheet with responsible team, efforts, number of controls that you have, and then have the timelines as well, which will become extremely helpful for you when you'll do your remediation. Now, this is just a quick snapshot of how we conducted the gap assessment at Ginger. So as you can see in the first column, we have all the domains listed. And in the subsequent tabs, I have all the controls that we needed. And for each of the domains, I have the start date and the end date with the timeline and the status for all the domains. Once you do this, you will start speaking to your different teams and ask about the illustrative procedures that you've implemented or that you need to implement. And after you are done with the entire exercise of gap assessment, you can have this sheet which will give you what do you need to do. So after you did the gap assessment, you can have the gap remediation done. Here also, we followed the similar process. We had column with all the domains. And then for policies, procedures, implemented, measured, and managed, how many gaps did we identify? Once we identified those gaps, we had the start date and the end date, and then the timelines and the status. And this becomes extremely useful when you have to submit your evidences as well. Because what you're going to do is to download all the controls from MyCSF with their illustrative procedures. And you are going to compare each of those illustrative procedures with the controls that you have implemented. If you don't have any of those, you can track those in this spreadsheet, and that should serve as a good remediation exercise for you. If you can take one thing from the entire presentation, this should be it. You need to do the gap assessment and remediation yourself to build those relationships and keep the cost down. The second guidance that I have is to make sure that you have HITRUST part of your information security program. Now, HITRUST is extremely prescriptive. And every single thing that you're doing in your company right now, or you want to do in your company right now, can be tied back to the HITRUST project. If you're implementing any tools, please make sure that you are having that tied back to the CSF domain. If you're starting a new project for your SAST or DAST or SDLC, whatever it may be, make sure that it's tied back to the. Give you a couple of examples for annual risk assessment, which I believe every company does. There's this entire domain, domain number 17 in MyCSF that you can download or you can download. along with the prescriptions that what MyCSF requires. Even if you're doing the annual risk assessment, what you need to do is just to extend that a bit so that you have the prescriptions from MyCSF, and then you are doing your annual assessment in accordance with the prescriptive guidance from. Similarly, for vendor management, I'm pretty sure all companies do this, but if you identify that you have some gaps in your vendor management, make sure that you're using the vendor, the prescription from domain number 14, which is the third-party assurance. For penetration test, if you're conducting penetration test or vulnerability assessments, make sure that you're having the prescriptive guidance from MyCSF, which is domain number 7, vulnerability management. And just to give you an example, when we did the pen test, or when we started this project, HITRUST project, we did not have a proper vulnerability management program. So we took the guidance from MyCSF and we started that entire program for us, which helped a lot in our submitting the evidences and so on. And lastly, for deletion requests, if you are processing customer or member deletion requests, please make sure that you are taking the guidance from domain number 19, which is data privacy, and you are having all the guidance from MyCSF on how to process the deletion request, how to track the timelines and everything that can be done to cater to such requests. All of that is available from HITRUST. Now, these are just a few examples, and I would highly recommend you check the other domains as well. I'm pretty sure you are doing all of these things in your company, but you are not. The third bullet that I have is initiate an organization-wide security awareness program. Now, we all know the security awareness trainings that we do within 30 days of onboarding and then annually thereafter. But to have the HITRUST certification done, you have to have a security awareness program and not a training. There's a major difference between both. And if you're a fan of ISACA just like me, this in all their books that executive sponsorship is the most important thing to have the HITRUST certification done. I'm done. But I believe for HITRUST, the individual buy-in and support is more important than the executive sponsorship. Pieces of evidences from these different teams. So it becomes a lot on their if you don't have their buy-in. So at Ginger, what we did was we started this program called Security Insider Program with volunteers from each team. So rather than forcing somebody to give us the evidences, we wanted them to be a part of the HITRUST project. And we have that done by starting this program, Security Insider Program, and they were an extension of the security team and not a different team who were working on their own. We trained them on different security controls. We trained them on tracking the shadow IT apps. We trained them on becoming application admins for applications which are not managed by IT or security. Which is a SaaS application and they don't support SSO. Your team can just go and start. You will have no visibility into that. And that's extremely important to know when you're having this highly relied infrastructure in SaaS. We trained them on role-based access control. So they were responsible for tracking the role-based controls or role-based access for their team. So I know we all hate shared passwords. But there are some websites where you can't just help having shared passwords. Facebook, if you have a marketing page, they don't have a separate account for your admin and then non-admin. But how do you manage those passwords when you have a team of 3 working on this huge project along with all the different things? You ask your security insiders, you train them, you track those in Google Sheets and similar to make sure that those are all tracked and rotated when required. This is something that I learned after we achieved our certification. And this is a certification that is provided by HITRUST themselves. So I would highly, highly recommend get at least one team member HITRUST CCSEP certified. CSF is extremely rich in functionality, but it's complex to navigate. It seems that they are using some software from the but it has a lot of functionality, and you need to use all those functionality for your SaaS services or for your HITRUST. So if you have infrastructure that is in AWS, Azure, or GCP, what you can do is you can inherit the controls from them rather than having all those controls implemented by yourself. If you have a platform as a service provider such as Datica or similar, you can implement some of the controls from them rather than implementing all those controls by yourself. And what you need to do is to use the inheritance functionality in HITRUST or MyCSF to inherit all those controls. The second function is diary. So rather than having a lot of email communication with your external assessors on the guidance that they need or the evidence that they need, what you can do is you can use this diary function within MyCSF. And this will allow you to have these conversations directly with your external assessors on that particular control. So rather than having those email exchanges between your teams and MyCSF folks and the external assessors, you can have this diary function, which will be extremely helpful to reduce that communication and get things done faster. And lastly, delegation. If you know you have a different privacy team altogether, you can delegate the entire domain to them. If you have a different vendor management domain, you can delegate the entire domain to them. And similarly, there are a bunch of other domains which are related to wireless security, which you can delegate to your IT teams, removable media domains, and so on and so forth, which you can delegate to different teams. So this is extremely important to learn and understand that how do you make the most of your MyCSF tool. And lastly, you need to understand the scoring rubric. There is no way that you will be able to pass the certification if you don't have a good understanding and a good external assessor with this scoring rubric understanding. HITRUST recently changed their scoring rubric. They, in 2019-2020, they changed the scoring rubric of policies, procedures, and implemented. And if you understand the scoring rubric correctly, what you can do is to focus on things that are most important to you. Rather than having a lot of efforts done in the managed or measured, you can choose to have more efforts on the policy side, or more efforts in maturing your procedures, or more efforts in just implementing the scores, which is the most important domain in HITRUST. And all of that will be extremely helpful if you understand the rubric and Prisma methodology that HITRUST uses to mark the control requirements. Lastly, identify the inheritance controls. So this is something that we did at Ginger for our AWS, which is IaaS provider, as well as Datica, which was our PS providers. And what you can do is you can leverage the shared responsibility metrics from HITRUST themselves. So you don't need to figure out what are the controls that I can leverage for my MyCSF or my domains. HITRUST has this extensive guidance with the domain ID, the control ID, with the percentage that you can inherit. And it's extremely helpful to have all of this done and sorted even before you start your external assessment. For that, what we did was we reached out to AWS and we had a soft approval even before we started our HITRUST journey. And we took the guidance from the shared responsibility metrics. We asked our account manager, AWS account manager, to connect us with someone in the compliance team. They connected us with somebody in the compliance team. We developed this relationship. And it so happened that when we submitted the controls for their soft approval via email and Google Sheet, they came back saying that these are not the right controls and you need to do some more work. But since we had that relationship, we were able to get that done quickly. We were able to get them on the phone and then speak about how we can leverage the MyCSF and shared responsibility metrics. And all of that helped us a lot in expediting that request. Now, please keep in mind that when you're submitting this inheritance request to MyCSF in the portal, there are hundreds of different companies who are submitting the requests at the same time. They all want to get their inheritance request submitted and approved as soon as possible from the IaaS providers. But if you don't have that relationship, it may not get prioritized and this might delay your certification. So you want to make sure that you have all those tools identified beforehand, you have controls identified beforehand, and then you have the soft approvals for each of those. This is extremely important as well, that you need to include the technical controls in SDLC. HITRUST has this policy, procedure, and implemented, and what they do is they have different scores for each. And for some reason, HITRUST pays a lot more attention on the implemented part. As I mentioned earlier as well, there is always this dichotomy between the engineering team and the compliance teams, and they don't speak the same language, and sometimes you may not have some of the tools implemented. So you need to make sure that you are having all those tools in your SDLC from the very start, or as soon as you can. There are some tools, we don't use all these tools at Ginger. These are just examples that you can use open source tools like Defect Dojo for your vulnerability management if you don't have a project management tool. You can use OSIC, which is an open source tool for your HIDS and extremely important control for the MyCSF domain. You can use OWASP ZAP for your DST, and you can use GitHub Dependabot for your dependency issues. So just a sample of tools. I have seen companies using Prometheus and Grafana for their log management, and they were able to use that as a source for their HITRUST evidence. I have seen companies using Wazoo or Snap IT for their asset management and log management, and they were able to pass the HITRUST certification from that evidence. So tools, regardless of what tools you do plan to implement, you need to make sure that you are implementing some of the tools. Now, having tools is one thing, but please make sure that you are having all those guidance, all these tickets in a project management tool. HITRUST is extremely stringent in the evidence that they require. And if you have these tickets and fixes in a project management tool, it will be extremely easy for you to show these tools or show these tickets to your external assessor and then move from there. This one is pretty unique to our infrastructure, but I wanted to lay this out as well. You have to implement a SaaS management tool. If you are a SaaS-based company like us, and you don't have a SaaS management tool, it becomes extremely difficult to cater to those services. At one point, or across all Ginger, we had 300 plus applications across the environment. Of course, some of those were marketing applications, some of those were just applications for brainstorming when everybody hit COVID. But there will be some applications where you'll be storing your PII and PHI. And if you don't have a proper understanding of your SaaS environment, it will be extremely difficult to keep track of all these services. The second benefit of having a tool like this is you can do your due diligence a lot more efficiently. You can have your SOC 2 reports within the SaaS management tool. You can have the BAAs and the DPAs within that tool. You can have business owners in the SaaS management tool for each of the applications. You can have the annual reviews for each of those applications and who are the owners and who are the users and so on and so forth. So if you have a good SaaS management tool, it will alleviate a lot of your pain for achieving HITRUST, and not just HITRUST, but to maintain your IT. Of course, the SaaS management tool is useful in annual compliance review, monitoring, tracking any corrective action plans, data deletion, and contract termination. So if you are terminating a contract with one of the vendors, you want to make sure that you are receiving this alert from the service itself that you terminated the contract. You want them to delete all your data that they hold for you. This one again may sound a bit ubiquitous that everybody does that. Why do we need to have electronically approved documentation? But I have seen companies lose their marks because they did not have the electronically approved documentation. Now, there are two things when you are talking about approval or document or policy and procedure approval. One could be just an approval where you have your change table or change history table and you say, yep, this is the owner, this is the reviewer, this is the approver, and we are all good. And that should be sufficient for your SOC 2 or ISO. But for HITRUST, they have something called a bake period. So if you don't have a proper date on your HITRUST documentation in your policies and procedures, they may not consider as a proper policy and procedure. For HITRUST, currently the requirement is you have to have your policies and procedures approved electronically before 60 days of your external validated audit. You have to have the implementation done before 90 days of your external validated audit. And if you don't have this, you might lose some marks in your scoring rubric that you really want to avoid. You can use services like DocuSign, HelloSign, Adobe Sign, and all of that could do the job of approval and seal the document before the bake period of 60, 90 days. If you take the second slide from this presentation, this should be it. Start with the relevant scope. I have seen companies expand their scope so much that they had 800 plus controls in their HITRUST audit. And it's extremely difficult to have all those controls done within the first iteration. So ask your assessor. If your assessor is good, they will ask you to tone down your scope to the most important buildings and infrastructure. Couple of examples. If you have office in San Francisco, you have office in New York, and you have office in London. But your offices in London and New York, they don't have anyone doing any IT work. They are just marketing people doing their marketing jobs. In the London office, they are just recording some sound. Do you really, really want to have this in the scope of your HITRUST? Ask your assessor. Would they be able to have this removed from your scope for the time being, and you can try to have them in the next iteration. But for your first assessment, ask your assessor as many questions as you can on toning down the scope. The second example is, do you need all the applications and business functions in the scope? And again, like I mentioned earlier, at one point we were using more than 300 plus applications at Ginger. But we didn't need all those applications to provide services to our customers. We were not storing any PII, PHI, or any confidential information in those services. So ask your assessor, can you tone down all those applications and only focus on the stuff that is most important to you and your customers and members. This should be your first priority after you decide on the scope. And lastly, ask yourself, can you obtain the passing score without testing for measured and managed? Now, HITRUST has this flexibility that you can choose not to have measured and managed in your scope. And what it does, of the 100 passing points or the 100 total points, you can choose policy, procedure, and implement it. And if you feel that you're confident enough in all those three, you don't need to have measured and managed in your scope. You can just go without them and then get scored out of those remaining 20, 20, and 40. I don't remember the exact percentage, but you can get tested from policy, procedure implemented, and not the measured and managed. So ask your assessor, but more importantly, ask yourself, do you feel confident enough to pass the certification without having the measured and managed in scope? And lastly, again, this might sound exactly like we do this all the time. But again, I'll reiterate here that document every single thing that you've been doing. Role changes, termination requests, contractor onboarding, and trainings. If you don't have an LMS, make sure that your contractor trainings you are tracking in a Google Sheet. You are asking for the screenshots when they're completing the trainings. If you don't have an IT system, make sure that you are asking for emails when the owners send out the emails to terminate employees to the IT team. If you don't have a proper tool to track the role changes, make sure that you are asking for email from the managers who is the manager right now and the lead manager who is going to be the next manager to ask for these role changes, emails, and notifications. And all of these will be extremely important when you will do your HITRUST. If you're doing any updates to policies, if you're evaluating any tools, make sure that you have a business case, you have a comparison, you have the business case approved from somebody in the team, like a senior manager. You have the budget approved for that tool. If you're disposing or wiping any assets, make sure that you are at least maintaining a Google Sheet. Extremely important to have this done as well. If you are processing deletion requests for CCP and GDPR, make sure that you are tracking all of those as well. If you are conducting penetration tests, vulnerability management, make sure that you have all those remediations documented as well. All of these will play a huge, huge role in your HITRUST evidence collection when you will be in that phase. And a couple of things that I can mention, maybe if you're attending this conference, document this. If somebody is achieving a new certification, document that. That will be a part of your workforce development plan control, which is like a 50 or 20 odd controls in domain 1. So document all of these as well, that you attended this talk, or you did the RSA conference, or you have this budget for employees to do the certifications. All of that will come extremely handy. And even for your internal training, so if you have training for the incident response, make sure that you have the video recordings for that. Make sure that you have the email notifications out for that, and the calendar invites, and then all of that stuff will be extremely handy for different domains, and you need to track each of those. Okay, so to summarize, be proactive in your communication with internal and external stakeholders. Again, when I say internal stakeholders, these are your legal teams, your compliance teams, your privacy teams, engineering, marketing, HR, people ops, talent, because they will be doing the JD for security folks. So make sure that you are proactive in your communication on what's the requirement for this HITRUST certification. And then be equally proactive with the external stakeholder expectations as well. Be extremely proactive in communicating with AWS, if you are using AWS. Be proactive in communicating with HITRUST or your external assessor. And all of those will pay in leaps and bounds when you'll be in your external audit phase. The second summary that I have is agree on the minimum required scope with your external assessor. This is extremely important to keep the cost down, and more importantly, keep the budget and time down. All of those will play a part in your external assessment when you do the audits. So make sure that you agree on the minimum required scope, at least for your first iteration. And lastly, make use of HITRUST illustrative procedures for your information security program. HITRUST has this very, very prescriptive procedures for each of the controls on what they need. So make sure that you are using them to the most of your abilities, and you are tracking those all the way for each of the bullets and domains. This will be helpful for you when you will do the gap assessment and remediation and move forward from there. And this is the third most important slide from my presentation. HITRUST is not a sprint, definitely not a marathon, but a 5,000 meter relay. And I would like to explain that a bit as well, why I chose that statement. If you are doing an assessment like SOC 2 or ISO, you can get it done once, and then you don't need to work on that again and again. SOC 2 is valid for 2 years, and you don't need to have or valid for 1 year, but you don't need to do a lot of stuff in that. If you think of HITRUST as a marathon, but marathon is a one-player game, and you cannot win HITRUST with a one-player game. Even if you're willing to run 42 kilometers alone, it will not serve the purpose of HITRUST. You have to have the buy-in from different teams, because ultimately they will be the ones supporting you at the end of the audit, and providing all the evidences and helping you with the volunteering for the security team, and so on and so forth. So it's definitely not a marathon. You have to have the support from different teams. And the last piece is, it's a 5,000 meter relay. So it's not a 1,000 meter relay. You have to put in some efforts. It's a 5,000 meter relay where you will have to have a bunch of players supporting you to win the race. You as a team will be working with different teams internally. Those are some of the participants in your relay. You'll be working with AWS or your IS and PS providers. They are one participant in your relay. You will be speaking to your external assessors who are a whole different entity, and they will be helping you out a lot in the journey. And then lastly, the HITRUST themselves. So if you have a good relationship with HITRUST, they can get you with on the phone, and they will solve a lot of your issues, like uploading the evidences towards the end or doing the offline upload, and you will get to all of that when you will submit your MyCSF final assessment. But again, I just want to reiterate that this statement that HITRUST is not a sprint, definitely not a marathon, but a 5,000 meter relay. So be prepared for that. That's all I have. My contact details are here, the grcmusics.com. I like to write a lot about my work and philosophy and whatever it may be, my running adventures and so on and so forth. You can always reach out to me at shobhit@ginger.io, and I can share the Excel sheets with you from after obtaining some approval. And then my LinkedIn is Shobhit Mehta. And the slides are available here, so bit.ly and the code next to it is case sensitive. So the second S is a capital S, and you need to make sure that you are putting the right code in there. That's all I have. I'll open it for any questions, comments. Yep.
You mentioned rubric and maybe not being able to manage it and measure, but did you also select it and then also how we go to flexibility in scoring? Like I think you only need 70% to pass high trust. Would you also choose not strategically not to do certain implementation or even policy procedures because of the effort required to do that?
Sure. So the question is, did we strategically choose not to have policies, procedures implemented as well, not to have those because of the time or effort constraint? And the answer is no. For our first iteration, we did not have measured and managed. So we were heavily relying on those three domains: policies, procedures, and implemented. And since we did not use any external assessors for our gap assessment and remediation, we wanted to make sure that we make the most of what we are going for. And for that, if we strategically choose not to have something from policy, procedure, or implemented, it may come adversely on us towards the end that we did not have this, and now we are failing because you did not have that in the beginning. So even though we had to put in a lot of effort and implement a lot of tools, we did all of that, at least for those three domains. And like I mentioned, we developed a lot of procedure documentation, 42 of those, including policies. So we did do a very thorough job on those three domains. Yep.
How often has HITRUST been changing, publishing a new standard?
So the official guidance is they change at least every year. That's the official guidance that they have. So they are recently coming up with, or they recently came up with 9.6, which is a minor iteration, and they are planning to release version 10 sometime in the near future. But for the official guidance, they do want to have this updated at least on an annual basis. And they may not necessarily change all the controls themselves. They might add some authoritative sources. So even if you're on version 9.3, you don't necessarily need to go to version 9.6. If you're not going for those external authoritative sources, you can just rely on 9.3, and that should serve the purpose of your HITRUST audit. Yep.
You mentioned SaaS Management tool. What's some examples of the tool?
Yeah, I have two examples that I want to speak about. The first one that we use at Ginger. So of course, disclaimer, no sponsorship or nothing like that, but we use Blissfully at Ginger, which is extremely helpful to manage all the services. The best part about using Blissfully is it scans all the domains or all the emails, and then it gives you all like an overview of how many applications do you have and who are the users using those applications, how often are you having those applications used, who are the users, do you need to do any vendor approvals, and so on and so forth. So there are a bunch of functionalities, and they recently merged with another company called Vendor, VENDR. So if you have a tie-up with Vendor, you can get Blissfully for free, which is, again, a good thing. The other application that I want to speak about is App Omni. They are pretty good, but the only issue that I have with them is they don't do the discovery part. So like I mentioned, Blissfully scans all the Gmail emails, and then it will give you like an overview of all the applications, but App Omni cannot do that. You have to input the applications manually, and once you input the applications, then it will cascade to different sectors at for example, Slack, what bots do you have on Slack? For Gmail, what plugins do you have on Gmail? But it will not discover the applications itself, which I think is extremely important for a SaaS management tool. Exactly. Yep. Yeah, great question. We had a few corrective action plans. We had around 10 on our procedures. So I think that's something that we needed to work on. Like I mentioned, we did not use any external assessor for their guidance or consultancy. And that's why we lacked in the procedures bit. We did not have enough procedures for our disposal of IT and some of the things that are pretty common. We were doing all of that, but we did have some corrective action plans, so we had to work on those. For our interim assessment, so I'm not sure if you're familiar, but if you're doing your interim assessment, then you have to have all those gaps remediated along with one domain, one control from each domain. So we had that, all of that done in our interim, and we were able to get the interim letter as well. Yeah, good.
I know one of your assumptions was heavily leveraging SaaS applications. This could be a whole other talk, but do you have any other recommendations for those of us who have significant on-premise infrastructure going for HITRUST certification?
Yeah, so the question is, do I have any recommendations for folks who have a lot of on-prem infrastructure, they don't have a lot of SaaS? I believe all the bullets that I hit will help you in that scenario as well. The only thing is you will need to manage your on-prem infrastructure yourself. And if you are willing to do that and you have the capacity to do that, I think all of these will be applicable for that as well. When we started this journey of HITRUST at Ginger, we were only 3 folks, me, my CISO, and our one more IT person, and of course our data privacy officer. So we had very limited understanding, and we had very limited time with us to conduct all of that. So we did the best we could, and we were heavily relied on SaaS, so we implemented a SaaS management tool, and that served us really well. Yep.
Are there other areas to gather more details on the specific sort of CSF controlled reference numbers that when they've done an addendum? Because oftentimes the language is really cool. So for example, the one that I'm referring to, which says like closing network sessions after inactivity.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, that's a fairly vague concept. Does anyone have any kind of information about what that actually means?
Yeah. Yeah, so the question is, some of the language in HITRUST CSF is pretty vague, and is there a way we can try to figure out the exact control requirement behind that vague language? And I would say if you have such issues, the first source would be to go with your external assessor and then ask them what do they need to get the requirement done. The second thing that you can do is to see the source itself. So if you go to HITRUST website, you can download MyCSF, and you will be able to see each of the frameworks as well. So for this control where you say we have network activity session to be closed out after a period of time, HITRUST will give you the exact framework from where they picked the language. And you can search for this specific control in that framework itself and see what's the requirement. Do you really need to have those sessions closed, or this is something that you can work around with your external assessor, saying this is not even applicable to us. So I would say the first source would be your external assessor, and if you're not satisfied with their answer, then you would rather want to go to the source itself, which is the source for this control within MyCSF. Because MyCSF is nothing but like a combination of all these different authoritative sources. Yeah.
I guess with the controls, they have 3 different levels of control, sometimes level 1, level 2, level 3. Can you speak to, I guess, what percentage you had that were roughly level 1, level 2, and level 3 looks quite difficult to achieve in some cases?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the question is, there on the HITRUST itself, they have different level of controls, level 1, level 2, and level 3. And sometimes they ask you to implement level 3, sometimes they're okay with level 2. And of course, I would say speak with your external assessor. They should be the ones guiding you on which level of controls that you would need. Sometimes, I can speak for Ginger, we were extremely good on implemented. So even though for controls which only required level 2, we went for level 3 implementation. And because we did not want to lose any of those marks. And we did not even know about that until I did the MyCSF or CCSEP certification myself. So for Ginger, it did not matter to us a lot which level of control it was, because we were doing like the best we could to make sure that we are hitting all the top notches or right notches on that control framework.
Well, thank you, Shobhit, for presenting to BSidesSF, and on behalf of the conference and the conference gift speaker or sponsor Maltago, we want to give you this token of our appreciation.
Thank you, Vijay.
Thank you.